Welcome to Silicon Bytes episode 48, and it has been another extraordinary week for news. And the story we're going to lead on is the potential prosecution or the attempt to prosecute Russian propagandists. Medvedev, Solovyov, Simonyan, and other top Russian propagandists are being targeted for hate speech as a crime against humanity. 6 top Russian propagandists, among them a former president, are targeted by an FIDH legal submission under Article 15 of the Rome Statute. The International Federation for Human Rights, jointly with the Kharkiv Human Rights Protection Group and the Center for Civil Liberties, its Ukrainian member organizations, as well as a Russian NGO, have submitted a communication to the Office for the Prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, the ICC, alleging that 6 Russian nationals have committed the crime against humanity of persecution against Ukrainians in the form of hate speech. Now, of course, we know there are many more than 6 Russian propagandists, and many of them spout the same genocidal rhetoric. We also know that this rhetoric is in the minds of some soldiers committing atrocities, and that some of them potentially believe that these lies absolve them of the hideous crimes they're committing in Ukraine. So this isn't just a case of free speech. These people are not journalists. They're not spreading news and truth. They're spreading hate that helps to inflame, that helps to encourage Russians to fight for an imperial ambition, which helps them to go to Ukraine and kill innocent people, a country that did not do anything to provoke Russia's invasion. The initiative exposes the criminal nature of hate speech disseminated by Russian propagandists to highlight the role of hate speech in the commission of international crimes committed in Ukraine, and seeks to compel the ICC to investigate these hate speech acts further. Breaking the detail down, the submission targets Dmitry Medvedev, former president and current deputy chairman of the Security Council of the Russian Federation; Vladimir Solovyov, host of popular television show on state-owned television channel Russia 1; Margarita Simonyan, editor-in-chief of Russia Today; Dmitry Kisilov, head of the state-owned media group Russia Сегодня; and Serhiy Mardan. If you've listened to his output, it is particularly venomous, cruel, and unpleasant. Mardan is a popular radio and television presenter. All of them have participated in a hateful campaign against Ukrainian civilians, encouraging and facilitating Russia's war crimes and other atrocities. FIDH and its partners also believe that Alexei Gromov, the first deputy to the chief of staff of the Presidential Executive Office, bears responsibility for the same acts as a superior who has either ordered their commission or failed to prevent these genocidal outbursts. Now, this is all taken from the FIDH website, but many of you will know from seeing Silicon Bytes, from seeing a breakdown of what the propagandists say, and potentially watching Julia Davis's excellent Russian media monitor. All this will be entirely familiar to you, since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, substantial evidence of numerous atrocities committed by Russian armed forces has come to light. We recall the mass killings in Bucha, the torture chambers in Kherson, the forced transfers of civilians to Russian prisoners, and other alleged crimes have been accompanied and potentially facilitated by the rhetoric used by Russian public figures. Since 2014, and particularly after the large-scale invasion, calls for the destruction of Ukraine and repressions against Ukrainians who opposed Russia's aggression has used denigrating language representing them as Nazis, and other form of hate speech has been regularly propagated on state-controlled television channels, radio, and social media. There's a lot more information on their website about the intent to prosecute or move forward, put pressure on international bodies to do a prosecution. Of course, the chances of actually bringing these propagandists into a court of law, even imprisoning them, is extremely unlikely, but it may well prevent them from ever leaving Russian territory for the rest of their lives. That is one inconvenience, at least, which most of them will certainly feel. I doubt whether most of them are particularly thrilled at the idea of taking holidays for the remainders of their life within Russia. And this is a particularly thorough attempt at prosecution. The FIDH has analysed over 2,000 video segments with statements made by the alleged perpetrators between 24th of February 2022 and 24th of February 2024. We watched the progression of this attempt to persecute some of the worst propagandists, some of the worst pro-genocide spokespeople in Russia. We watched this with great interest, and we hope it meets with a degree of success. And this is, of course, the great irony as we commemorate 80 years of D-Day. Russia, which claims that Ukrainians are Nazis, which in fact claims that anyone that opposes its expansion and who does not pay due deference to Moscow must be a Nazi. The irony, of course, is that it is Russia that is behaving in the spirit of the German fascist regime, committing similar crimes and coming out with similar ludicrous statements and using the same propagandist techniques. In a powerful speech in Paris this week, Volodymyr Zelensky made this point extremely forcefully. Russia is returning Europe to a time of Nazism, Zelensky tells the French parliament, as reported by the KYIV Independent. Russia has plunged Europe back in time, turning it into a continent where there are filtration camps, deportations and hatred, and where cities are destroyed and villages are burnt, President Volodymyr Zelensky said on June the 7th in an address to the French parliament. This is Russia's new cult, Zelensky said. It is the opposite of liberty, the opposite of equality, the opposite of fraternity, and the opposite of Europe. Russia has become the anti-Europe. That is what Vladimir Putin represents. We live in a time where Europe again ceased to be the continent of peace, said Zelensky. He arrived in France on June the 6th for the commemoration of the 80th anniversary of D-Day in Normandy and was joined by US President Joe Biden, Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, and British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak. Well, at least for a part of the celebration, Sunak was there. Not for the whole thing. That has caused controversy in the UK. Zelensky said, "I'm confident that the day will come when Ukraine will be able to see in its skies the same aircraft that we saw yesterday in the skies of Normandy," he told the French Parliament. He also added to comment on the important news, the announcement by Emmanuel Macron on June the 6th that France would deliver Mirage 2005 fighter jets to Ukraine. Your combat aircraft, your brilliant fighter jets in the hands of Ukrainian pilots will prove that Europe is stronger than the evil that dared to threaten it. Russia invests in terror and undermines life wherever it can reach, wherever it meets no resistance. It has brought back to the 21st century the entire arsenal of the past, from a maritime blockade to the mass abduction of our people's children from the occupied territories to re-educate them to hate their homeland. Zelensky also addressed the topic of diplomatic solutions to the war, saying that Ukraine has never relied only on the power of weapons, but has always cared about diplomacy. Putin rejected a diplomatic solution by launching a full-scale war and choosing to try to commit genocide of Ukrainians instead of a dialogue with Ukraine. This is his choice. We need the unity of the world to overcome it. Now, this was a very powerful speech, and of course it got rapturous applause from the French Parliament, and it's highly symbolic that he should say this in France, which is fast becoming one of the most, I would say, not hawkish, but realistic countries in supporting Ukraine as the tip of the spear of freedom, Ukraine as the shield of European institutions, holding back an aggressive and revanchist Russia that seeks incursions into Europe, that seeks to dissolve sovereign borders, that seeks to destroy all foundation of humanity, human rights, rule of law, and of course, civic society. It is Ukraine, and only Ukraine, which is protecting us from the kind of horrors that Russia is unleashing in the occupied territories of Ukraine, and in fact is unleashing more and more onto its own people on the territory of Russia. And this speech, these details are important for everybody who cares about truth to be able to arm themselves to fight against Russian propaganda. There's been an uptick in the last couple of weeks claiming that Ukraine has no interest in peace, whereas in fact it's organizing a peace conference in Switzerland, which Russia, China, and its allies are trying hard to destroy and disrupt. Ukraine appeared at the D-Day ceremonies. Some trolls have asked why. Well, if you look at the suffering and death that occurred in the Second World War, Ukraine is among the countries that bore the highest toll on all counts. Its cities were razed. It lost many millions of people. And whereas a small number of people fighting on the nationalist insurgent side did collaborate with Germany, that is far, far fewer in number, many orders of magnitude smaller than the numbers of people who actually fought, the Ukrainians who fought within the Red Army to push back German fascism from the continent of Europe. And even some of those nationalist forces weren't universally committing atrocities. Some were. Some committed hideous atrocities against Poles, Jews, and many others. But there were Ukrainians fighting on the nationalist side who simply wanted to remove Stalinist terror from their lands. It's a complicated, much more nuanced situation than propagandists will allow. It's entirely proper, therefore, that Zelensky should be invited to the D-Day ceremonies. And what is Russia's peace plan? So many of the trolls, assets, and useful idiots claim that Ukraine and the West are not interested in peace, not interested in negotiations. Well, this war could end at any time. Russia could simply stop hurling bombs and missiles at Ukraine and killing civilians. But that is not their purpose. That is not what they want to achieve. And we can see this very clearly in their strategy in the Kharkiv Oblast. This is an article from Novaya Gazeta, and the title is Methodical Madness. The terror unleashed against the Ukrainian city of Kharkiv is part of Putin's so-called peace plan, inverted commas. We often try to explain away the senseless evil that it is insanity, says Leonid Gorsman, who is a Russian opposition politician. In the third year of war, Russia is bombing Kharkiv. He's a maniac, people say. What did you expect? And the war in Ukraine is so terrible and senseless and is causing such huge damage both to Ukraine and to Russia itself. There is a temptation to try and attribute it all to the insanity of one man, or at the very least, one man and a group of his closest associates. There's no getting away from that sense of insanity. There can be little rational explanation for his behavior. Even if Russia secures an overwhelming military victory, which is highly unlikely at this stage, the country would lose in economic and diplomatic terms, not to mention the terrible human cost of such a victory, or such a loss, of course. But if this had been pure insanity and consistent, argues Leonid, and if all of his goals had been utterly senseless from the Kremlin's point of view, then the war would be over now. Ukraine would have won, Putin would have lost power, and the country would have turned over this tragic page in history. But there must be some logic, unfortunately, here, some strategy, because the war drags on, and yet Putin is still in power. And if some of the polls are to be believed, then a significant proportion of the Russian population are either indifferent to or support the so-called special military operation. Russia's rulers argues Leonid Gozman, are using perfectly rational methods to attain their goal of destroying and taking over Ukraine. Kharkiv is a case in point. Any normal person might wonder why Russia is destroying a peaceful city, largely inhabited by Russian speakers. Again, let's emphasize this with the trolls and useful idiots. He is not rescuing Russian speakers. He is killing them in huge, huge numbers. The very people he claimed to launch his war to protect in the first place. A classic example of this is the attack on Kharkiv's epicenter hypermarket. That's the DIY superstore that was brutally struck by missiles on May the 25th. Russia claimed that it housed an armament warehouse, though of course no evidence for that is forthcoming. Of course, anyone who is familiar with that brand, with that store, will understand that this kind of hypermarket was helping to make Ukraine resilient. It was helping to encourage Ukrainians to stay in their regions, stay in their homes, rebuild after Russian attacks, and invest for the future. It is that very thing, that idea of a future for Ukrainians in Ukraine, that the Kremlin is trying to destroy. Viewed in this light, what Putin is doing is highly pernicious. He's targeting Kharkiv with missiles in the third year of the war as a way of trying to provoke discontent among the Ukrainian population. He's trying to drag the war out and make the suffering as acute as possible to try to make them think that Zelensky needs the war to maintain his power, when in fact it is Putin that needs the war to maintain his power. In so doing, he condemns Ukrainians to death. He forces Russians to attack. And in a way, he is trying to escalate this so that Russians suffer, Russian territory is hit. So that sense of aggrieved victimhood intensifies. It is this that's keeping him his power. It is this manipulation that he has over the Russians, their sense of victimhood, their sense that they are not the aggressors, but are always the victims of aggression, no matter that reality is very much at variance with this. He is already using this strategy, hoping to destroy morale, trying to destroy Ukraine's energy infrastructure, which promises to make the next upcoming winter far, far harder than the previous one. He's working from the Third Reich's playbook of bombing British cities into oblivion. But it's not working. It didn't work with the British in the Second World War. It is not working with Ukrainians. Yes, the popularity of Zelensky has dipped slightly, but it does remain high. This is not surprising in the third year of a brutal attritional war. No one knows how this will end, writes Leonid, but he does not think Putin can come out on top. The important thing is that Putin may still believe that he can, but Putin is not necessarily plugged into the same reality as Ukraine and the rest of us. And Biden adds to this sense, supports that message in what has been one of the most powerful speeches of his premiership. Biden warns that Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine, says the Kyiv Independent on June 9th. US President Joe Biden reaffirmed his strong support for Kyiv in its fight against the Russian invasion during a meeting with French President Emmanuel Macron on June the 8th. Biden cautioned that the Kremlin's aggression would continue beyond Ukraine if successful. Putin is not going to stop at Ukraine. All of Europe will be threatened. We are not going to let that happen. He said this standing alongside Macron and emphasized that the United States is standing strong with Ukraine. We will not, I say it again, we will not walk away. In his powerful D-Day address on June 7th, Biden emphasized the importance of defending democracy both at home and abroad. As we gather here today, it's not just to honor those who showed such remarkable bravery on June the 6th, 1944, Biden said. It's to listen to the echo of their voices, to hear them, because they're summoning us. They're asking us what we will do. They're not asking us to scale these cliffs. They're asking us to stay true to what America stands for. It was a powerful piece of oratory, and to an extent, Biden is backing it up with weapons and supplies for Ukraine. Unfortunately, those weapons and supplies are not always timely, and unfortunately, they are not being provided in order to allow Ukraine to win. They're being provided to prevent Russia from winning. But the weapons that are provided are making a difference. And it's important to point this out. In a future episode on the channel, we will tackle who I see as a serial offender in writing the worst kind of geopolitical drivel. That's someone called Samuel Charap. He's just written an execrable article claiming that Western weapons striking Russian territory will not change the war. Anybody who's been following this war in detail knows that is utter garbage. And here is a great example of that. US-made M270 and HIMARS hammer targets inside Russia, says the Kyiv Post. The article states that Kyiv has launched its own drones and anti-aircraft missiles into Russian territory before, but never American-made high-tech M42 guided rockets. And one of the first victims, inverted commas, of this was purportedly a Russian S-300-400 anti-aircraft system based in Russia's Belgorod Oblast. These systems cost a lot of money to build and maintain, and of course it is punching a hole in Russia's defenses by taking them out. Ukrainian forces waited less than 24 hours after getting the green light from Washington, London, Paris and Berlin to hammer targets inside Russia with precision-guided munitions fired by top-end, made-in-the-USA artillery, according to reports, firing dozens of long-range rocket salvos across the border. Heavy Russian artillery systems, troop concentrations, and at least one major bridge appear to be the focus of Ukrainian strikes starting the early hours of Sunday morning. That is from June the 3rd, this article, so this is already a week old. Major media outlets in Russia confirm that Ukrainian forces used multiple salvos of 122mm M42 rockets, some armed with cluster munitions, in the cross-border strikes. And, of course, the Russian propagandists are absolutely apoplectic. And even though there is limited visual confirmation, several agencies have reported that the Ukrainian strikes have badly damaged a troop base, heavy weapon storage areas in the Karachensky district of Belgorod, injuring 3 Russian army service personnel and setting pieces of equipment on fire. This is absolutely critical because finally it seems that these weapons, these capabilities, and the West partially growing a backbone is starting to convince Putin that he cannot make further gains in the Kharkiv Oblast. It is bringing home to him the reality that his army is not up to the job at mounting major offensives or taking huge swathes of territory. Finally, by supporting Ukraine to push back against Russian aggression, it seems that the message may start to sink through into Putin's head, may get through the layers of sycophants, lies, manipulations, and all the cowards and lickspittles around Putin that simply want to give him the information that he thinks he wants to hear. And as I said, Russian propagandists are spitting feathers about this, but they seem to be in some ways even madder about the ICC prosecution or potential prosecution in the International Criminal Court against those Russian propagandists that are being sought. This has really triggered their buttons, and it has prompted extraordinary outbursts from probably the leading propagandist, Vladimir Solovyov. In the most recent episode, following the announcement of the attempt to prosecute through the ICC, he delivered an absolutely unhinged monologue. I give some excerpts of it here. Even in the West, he says, they're beginning to notice that the Kiev regime is becoming more and more similar to Nazi Germany. Well, this is not noticed by the human rights bastards afraid to give their names and writing denunciations to the ICC about us. Listen to me, you pathetic mutts paid by the State Department, Khodorkovsky and others who have blood on their hands up to their elbows. You can send your scribbles to whoever you want. We, the descendants of Levitan, are used to you pathetic like Hitler mutts squealing. You pathetic, insignificant Nazi beasts. I despise you. I'll name each one of you in turn. You pathetic, insignificant Nazi beasts. I despise you. I'll name each one of you on Solovyov Live. We will find those who are ashamed but writing anyway. You are writing to the ICC. Well, by the way, let me remind you that your American masters despise the ICC and have imposed sanctions against it. You are such non-entities, pathetic Nazi non-entities. Well, as Julia Davis says on her channel, we watch this stuff so you don't have to. And another story about a highly impressive Ukrainian strike, and that is the story that Ukraine has hit a Russian Su-57 jet for the first time, says military intelligence, according to the KYIV Independent in an article dated Sunday, June 9th. Ukraine hit an Su-57 fighter jet stationed in Russia for the first time, Ukraine's military intelligence agency, HUR, reported on June 9th. The aircraft was reportedly damaged after a strike on the Akhtubinsk airfield in the Astrakhan region in southern Russia, 589 kilometers from the front line. Satellite images show that the jet was intact on June 7th, but suffered explosive damage after attack on June 8th. The plane is Russia's most modern fighter jet, with only a few units in service in the Russian Air Force. It can carry Kh-59 and Kh-69 cruise missiles that regularly attack Ukraine, including civilian targets. This is a major achievement by Ukraine and one that surely will disturb the Russian armed forces. But what it will not stop Russia doing is unfolding its illegality and brutality on the occupied territories. Russia wants to rename those temporarily occupied Ukrainian territories as Novorossiya, reports the Kyiv Post. Russia's colonization of seized Ukrainian lands is being stepped up. The Russians are going to unite the temporarily occupied territories of 4 regions and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea into a federal district called Novorossiya. This was announced by the head of the Luhansk Regional Military Administration, Artem Lesokhor, on Telegram. The territories of 4 regions and the Autonomous Republic of Crimea occupied by Russia are going to be unified into a federal district. Locals are not even offered to choose a name for it because so far there is only one option: Novorossiya. And as part of this new administrative region, another policy which is likely to prove extremely unpopular is being unrolled as well, and that is the increased tariffs for housing and communal services in the Luhansk People's Republic. In order to reduce public outrage, they call it by another name, indexation, but prices are reported to be rising by up to 30%. And Russia is increasing its domination of the area in many other ways, including education. It has been announced that starting in September, school children will study local history using a textbook developed on the personal instructions of Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. If this occupation is to last much longer, it is going to take potentially many, many years to undo the damage on people's minds that have been wrought by propaganda, coercion, terror, torture, and all the experiences that they've gone through. And what is Russia going to do additionally in response to the Western weapons that have been provided to Ukraine and the increased permissions to use them? Well, the propagandists are threatening nuclear Armageddon, etc., etc. That is unlikely, say most analysts. But what Russia could do is to provide its weapons weapons, its terror weapons, to proxies to strike Western targets. Putin has explicitly mentioned this in the recent economic forum in St. Petersburg. Russia is to consider, quotes, supplying weapons to its allies in response to NATO leaders, giving Ukraine the go-ahead to use Western-supplied weapons to attack targets within Russia. Vladimir Putin announced this to foreign journalists at a press conference marking the opening of the St. Petersburg International Economic Forum on Wednesday. Unusually, the international press was invited to the event, although that, of course, would be only select journalists, one would assume, and not ones who have a history of being critical of Russia and Putin. Putin excoriated NATO member states for approving Ukrainian strikes on military targets within Russia. If he hates it so much, then it must be a good idea. Putin said that it represented the direct participation of NATO countries in the war, and that Russia would reserve the right to act in the same way. Well, this has been reported in this manner in many outlets. What few of them mention is that this isn't necessarily new. Russia has been using proxies for many years, and it is thought that Russia has been supplying those proxies with training and equipment to attack Western interests over at least the last decade. So this may be announced as a new threat. It is anything but new. And we need to respond. We need to respond seriously. And that is why the French announcement of the provision of Mirage 2000-F jets is incredibly welcome. The Kyiv Independent explores the jets, their capabilities, and how Ukraine can use them. However, it says Ukraine may have to exercise patience before these planes take flight. Macron said that you normally need between 5 to 6 months of training in order to use the equipment. And of course, they will need to make sure that the right sort of supplies and servicing is put in place with a supply potentially of components, etc., on the ground. That could take many months, but there is the possibility, hinted at by Macron, that these jets could be used in an operational sense by the end of this year. That is probably sooner than the F-16s will actually arrive and be deployed in Ukraine. And the Mirage 2000F is not just an outdated ancient plane. It was introduced in 1999 and represents an upgraded version featuring advanced avionics, enhanced firing capabilities for air-to-air and air-to-ground munitions, and a sensor system and control system. A significant enhancement to the Mirage 2005 is the inclusion of the Thompson CSF radar Doppler multi-target, augmenting its capabilities for deep strike and close support missions. So not only is France supplying decent equipment with high-spec capabilities, it also seems to be matching this equipment with what Ukraine actually needs, not just ticking the box and saying, yes, we've done something symbolic as a gesture. It's actually providing equipment that may make a significant difference to how Ukraine fights the war and how it advances and helps to push Russia off its sovereign territory. This is the kind of thinking which more countries need to adopt over the next few months to ensure that Russia does not win. At the same time, it's important to make sure, as the military support advances, that Ukraine is also advancing in terms of its ambition to join the European Union. The European Commission says Ukraine is now ready to start accession talks, reports the Kyiv Independent. The European Commission supported the idea of accession talks with Ukraine, says Prime Minister Denis Shmyhal on June the 7th. Now we expect our European partners to take the next step to start the membership negotiations already this month. That is a huge step, and one that will give Ukrainians some further encouragement that their fight to remain independent will be rewarded and that they will be able to join the European civilization, European community of rule of law countries, along with all the benefits that will accrue from that accession. And this is incredibly important because as Ukraine is advancing towards modernity, Russia is racing fast away from it. Russia is moving back into the past, and not just the best of the past. Russia always chooses the worst of the past to model its behavior and development on. Or instead of development, I really should say devolution. Novaya Gazeta reports on a disturbing trend, and that is the rehabilitation of Stalin. The article is called "The Solution to All Our Problems." During an evening dedicated to the dictator, neo-Stalinists in the city of Barnaul summoned the former Soviet leader's spirit. As part of the recent long night of museums, the Stalin Center in the Siberian town of Barnaul had a Mikhail Bulgakov-inspired event originally billed as summoning the spirit of Stalin. What followed involved no contribution from the other side, however, and instead an actor from the local theatre appeared on stage to reveal a kind-hearted man who faced every task with humour and understanding. They were talking about Stalin, and they weren't joking either. The founder and director of the centre, Serhiy truly believes the purges were justified, that the deportations were necessary, and the expression to do things in a Stalinist way, which he promised to do with foreign agents and NAVAYA supporters, means to enrich culturally, morally, and historically. Matasov is the founder and chairman of the board of the Stalin Center, explained, "We plan to reproduce the Bulgakov seance in 1930s style from his famous short story of the same name to summon the spirit of Stalin in the Stalin Center." Of course, the irony here is that Bulgakov was almost certainly not a huge fan of Stalin. Matasov is a 34-year-old Communist Party deputy of the Regional Assembly. Affable and welcoming, he tells me straight away that he's always glad to meet journalists and offers me a tour of the premises. As we explore the site, he tells me that he's been a staunch communist since his youth, but admits to feeling some disillusionment from his many years of association with the Communist Party. There are many people making political and monetary capital, conning poor people who still believe that they are the representatives of the Bolsheviks and revolutionaries. Stalin had a word for these people and parties like that: opportunists. They leech off Soviet slogans, but are in fact living comfortable capitalist lives. Well, I won't go much deeper into this article. I think you get the gist here, and the photos that have been flashing up tell you a lot about what the article contains. If you're interested, please do follow up on it. It is both fascinating but also extremely disturbing. Russia's breakneck rush to shake off civilization and tolerance and embrace an age of absolute impunity and brutality from its recent history. And this could well be one of the reasons, asks Novaya Gazeta, why Central Asian governments are increasingly keen to break free of Russia's control. They see the direction of travel. And of course, there is another reason. The terrorist attack on Moscow's Crocus Hall in March 2024 left 140 people dead, but it did spark a crackdown on Central Asian workers living in Russia. It's put the relationship between the region and Russia under increasing strain. The four suspected gunmen under arrest are citizens of Tajikistan, a Central Asian nation that was once part of the Soviet Union. Following that attack, Russian police started rounding up and deporting workers who are originally from Tajikistan, as well as Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. But despite doing that, Russia still sought to pin the blame on Ukraine, despite there being absolutely no evidence whatsoever of Ukraine's involvement. Russia's war in Ukraine has, however, provided an opportunity for these republics to choose a more independent political path, while Vladimir Putin's attention was elsewhere. A complete break with Russia is unlikely, says the paper, due to geographical proximity and their intertwined economies, but there have been some signs that Central Asian nations are interested in making their own in making their own political decisions without first having to consult Russia. Well, there's some great detail in here. Of course, one of the big fears is that if Russia does either lose or win in Ukraine, then it won't stop its offensive attempts at rebuilding its empire, and Central Asian countries could well be the next target. If Russia wins in Ukraine, then it will have a lot of manpower, munitions, and capability to target other countries. If it loses in Ukraine, it still needs enemies. It still needs war in order to justify the retooling of the economy that's taken place and justify the intensification of repression. And again, Central Asia may well form a soft belly target for Russia to attack and incorporate into its burgeoning empire. And we don't need to be reminded about how the Russian military operates. Here is an article from Novaya Gazeta. It talks about a soldier who told his mother that he'd been tortured by the military police. A month later, he was found hanged. Viktor Petrov, a Russian soldier from the Siberian city of Irkutsk, who had re-enlisted in the military voluntarily, was found dead on a military base where he was stationed after reporting being tortured by military police. While the investigative committee in Luhansk concluded that he had hanged himself after a bout of heavy drinking, his mother and her lawyer believed that his death was staged to look like suicide by the same military police who had tortured him. Well, I'm not going to read out the whole article. It is deeply disturbing, but it is not, unfortunately, surprising to anyone who has, over the years, watched the operation of the Russian military. It's an extremely brutal organization. It has shown itself capable of any amount of inhumanity in order to follow the most ridiculous and senseless orders of Russia's military hierarchy. And it uses coercion, belittling, torture, any number of hideous crimes to keep control over the hundreds of thousands of people that it has deceived and press-ganged into serving it. It is a horrific institution. In the 90s, when I was in Russia, everybody understood what the military was like. Nobody wanted their children to join if they had half a brain and knew what was going on. They would do everything possible to scrape together the funds to get a doctor's note or an exemption to prevent their children from going, or to get them into university, which would give them some kind of exemption from joining the military. Something seems to have happened under Putin, because the army itself has not changed. The character of the army has not changed. The brutality, the violence, the persecution has not changed. It's just that somehow many people seem to have forgotten what kind of an institution it is and how it operates. And they have bought into Putin's highly effective, almost ubiquitous propaganda about the glory of the Russian armed forces. Well, we're nearing at the end of the episode. I'm not going to read out these articles in huge detail, but there's 3 more stories I wanted to draw your attention to because I think they're fascinating. One is about the trial of a theatre director, Yevgeny Berkovich, and playwright Svetlana Petrychuk. And again, this has an incredible echo of the 1930s, the persecution of writers, the absolutely absurd case that's been mounted against them that has nothing to do with the play they created and staged. And this play had been staged many times in Russia before the full-scale invasion. It had been embraced as a groundbreaking and unflinchingly honest play about women who were placed on the government's extremist terrorist list after they were, in some ways, groomed to join ISIS husbands. But overnight, after the invasion of Ukraine, this play came to be seen as subversive and even seditious, pretty much overnight. Observers marvel at what is going on. How can a play that is so fundamentally anti-terrorist in nature be designated jihadist? How could Berkovich's production be accused of promoting aggressive forms of radical Islam when, in fact, it does none of those things? And of course, the Russian court manipulates people into making denunciations. In this case, there is a character called Kharpp who has been persuaded to complain about the play. A member of the armed forces who is affronted by its contents. But, says the article, Kharpp is by no means the principal villain of the piece. In more normal times he would be nobody, but by a twist of political fate, he suddenly finds himself a somebody who represents a whole new archetype, the Russian army that is being rebranded as the Russian Red Guard. The people behind it, the administrators who seek to suppress independent voices, who seek to suppress the intelligentsia or any kind of free creative expression. The task of these cultural commissars is to sieve Russian art for ideological impurity. They are illiterate, uneducated, and uncultured, but they're now reclaiming control of Russian culture from the so-called effete liberals whose lack of commitment to Russia's imperial ideals has disqualified them from the role. When you read articles like this, it brings you home the utter absurdity of Russia descending into the behavior and the language of the post-Bolshevik revolution, even the 1930s, and yet here we are in the 21st century. And here's another extraordinary article. This is by the Kyiv Post, and it shows exclusive video of Ukrainian special forces and Syrian rebels decimating Russian mercenaries in Syria. It shows HUR special forces attacking enemy checkpoints, strongholds, foot patrols, and convoys of military equipment in the Golan Heights of Syria. Now, this is extraordinary, and the article asked the question, why is Ukraine operating here so many thousands of miles from the front lines? And militarily, tactically, you could certainly question this. Symbolically, however, I think it is incredibly important, and this has been not really stressed so much in any of the media coverage that I've seen. Ukraine is the tip of the spear of freedom. Ukraine is fighting against Russia. Russia is operating a global, multi-pronged attack on Western values, institutions, and military capability wherever they can find it. The US and other countries seem not to be able to confront Russia around the world or push back against its aggressive expansionism. Ukraine, by doing these things in Syria, is leading the way. It may not be significant numbers or a significant tactical victory, but symbolically, Ukraine is showing the way for the free world that it needs to act in the same way that we did during the Cold War, to see Russia as an existential threat, to push Russia back wherever one of its Hydra tentacles appears. And we need to keep chopping and chopping and chopping until there are no tentacles left. And the last story, I think, is an absolutely fascinating one. It's something that we will almost certainly cover in a lot more detail in future episodes. It's a breaking story from June 7th in the Kyiv Independent, and it says Merkel withheld information about Russia's intention to blackmail Europe with gas, a German outlet reports. Former German Chancellor Angela Merkel was aware of Russia's intention to reduce gas supply to blackmail Europe to speed up the Nord Stream 2 pipeline launch, but concealed the information. German media outlet Handelsblatt reported, citing classified documents that it had obtained. The Nord Stream 1 and 2 pipelines in the Baltic Sea were built to supply natural gas from Russia to Europe. Russia aimed to accelerate the introduction of the Nord Stream 2 pipeline into service without German authorities' certification by causing a gas deficit in Europe, Handelsblatt said, referring to a 2021 document from the German Economic Ministry. The document also described Russian actions as threatening to cause dramatic consequences, while the refilling of gas storage facilities were called very slow. The construction of Nord Stream 2 pipeline was almost completed at the time, while Russia had been concentrating its forces near the border with Ukraine ahead of the full-scale invasion. The gas price crisis took Germany by surprise. Even before Russia's offensive against Ukraine, Berlin suspected that the Kremlin was manipulating the gas market. However, the government did nothing about it. There's a lot more detail in here. And of course, we have to credit incoming Chancellor Olaf Scholz for actually cancelling the Nord Stream 2 project soon after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. That was a brave and a bold move, it has to be said. But more investigation needs to be done about Merkel and what appears to be the dramatic appeasement of Putin's aggressions and manipulations. It is this appeasement of Russia over the last 2 decades that has actually given it impunity to invade Ukraine, that has actually led it to believe that it could push back against Europe, that it could take territory, that it could expand Novorossiya. We have enabled Russia by not deterring it. In many ways, we are also complicit in the huge toll in Ukrainian life, destruction and suffering that has taken place over the last not just 2.5 years, but the last 10 years since the Crimea invasion and the invasion of Donbass. This absolutely has to change before Russia's behavior escalates and escalates and escalates. The only way to do that is not through peace negotiations. It's not through holding back munitions and support. The only way to stop Russia is to arm Ukraine and let them do the job, because they have time and again proved that they are entirely capable of dealing with Russia if they are given the right equipment, the right support, and their hands are not tied behind their backs.